In the United States, why do conservatives and liberals seem to disagree about every political issue? You ever wondered that? Doesn't it sound weird to you that people are so easily grouped into two categories? People aren't binary like that. People are crazy and wild and diverse. Imagine if there were only two flavors of ice cream, for God's sake. And yet somehow topics like guns, global warming, Obamacare, refugees, abortion, the economy, jobs, the minimum wage, even foreign policy can be placed into either a liberal or conservative pigeonhole. Today, we're going to talk about why that is and how, in many ways, you didn't even have a choice on which side of the fence you fell. Weird thought, right? Well, things are about to get weird because we're about to talk anthropology. I'm Robert Stanley, and this is The Right to Reason. In 2008, the National Center for Biotechnology released an article written by two scientists, Plait and Harreveld, called The Instability of Health Cognition, where they performed studies on the memory of subjects that had been in pain during the test. In the assessment process, participants were questioned about how pain and other factors affected their performance. Participants in a pain-free test undervalued the effect of pain, while those that underwent the pain accurately measured the effect in relation to their performance. This was researching something called the empathy gap, and has been a favorite of the psychological and neurological research communities for some time. Research of the empathy gap has included topics of power, control, addiction, bullying, and even sexuality, where in this particular study, researchers delved into the realm of sexual decision-making and actually gave their subjects boners. Yeah, they gave them boners. Unaroused men failed to predict that in an aroused state, they would be more likely to make risky sexual decisions. Here's an easy way to think of the empathy gap. When you go to the grocery store hungry, you typically will pick items that you want to eat right away. That's why we all know grocery shopping while hungry leads to poor decision choices. The same empathy gap that causes us to fail to empathize with our future selves causes us to be unable to empathize with someone from an allegedly different moral framework. That yin-yang teaching that we're all aware of also applies to this topic as well. The objective morality that brings us together also has the potentiality to divide us. And when we divide by our morality, because of the empathy gap, we won't be able to understand or relate to people across the moral divide. In 2012, an anthropologist named Richard Schwetter, along with the help of two psychologists, Haidt and Graham, proposed something called moral foundation theory, which in a social psychological theory intended to explain the origins and the variations in human moral reasoning on the basis of innate modular foundations. 5 categories: care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, authority versus subversion, loyalty versus betrayal, and sanctity versus degradation. These are the frameworks of the moral foundation theory. They would test participants by asking questions like, how much money would it take for you to throw a tomato at a political candidate, or yell at your parents, or clean a toilet with the American flag? They found that liberals seem to care more about harm and fairness, while conservatives tend toward loyalty and sanctity. This is what anthropologists call your moral matrix. And while in it, you will have a very hard time empathizing with the alternative framework, and that defines our political viewpoints and ideologies. John Hibbing, a political scientist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, published in a peer-reviewed journal, Science, the results of the experiments he performed on both liberals and conservatives in 2008, where they recorded physiological responses to particular stimuli. Hibbing said, "We know that liberals and conservatives are really deeply different in a variety of things. It runs from their taste to their cognitive patterns, how they think about things, what they pay attention to their physical reactions. We can measure their sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight system, and liberals and conservatives tend to respond very differently." His research found that political participants on the left or right significantly differ in their bodily responses to threatening stimuli. The cool part of all this is that the participants were completely unaware of their own responses, like subtle eye movements, or that the test was political in nature. For example, startle reflexes after hearing a loud noise were stronger in conservatives, and after being shown a variety of threatening images like dazed individual with a bloody face with big spider crawling across it, open wound with covered maggots all over it. Conservatives exhibited greater skin conductance, a moistening of the sweat glands that indicates the arousal of a sympathetic nervous system, which manages the body's fight or flight response. Another interesting find was that the liberals often moved through the available images more quickly. Going on to the next photograph, while conservatives tended to spend more time focusing on them, getting all sweaty and tensed up. One might say that liberals tend to move on and not get fixated on negativity, while an equally respective viewpoint might be that liberals are less likely to focus on significant dangers or threats to their safety and the safety of those around them. We need to get away from viewing someone from that alternative political divide as the enemy. Often we're characterized as a bit of half and half in the U.S., both conservative and liberal. Both political tendencies are reasonable depending on your own system of morality, which you didn't choose, by the way. It seems a bit illogical and unconstructive as a nation for us to view half of our fellow Americans as our enemy, doesn't it? In Hibbing's trials, he would also test both liberals and conservatives' memory. He would show them both positive and negative images. They would then be shown a second series of images that had some new photos and some of the old ones mixed in. The test subjects would be asked to indicate whether they recognize an image that they had seen before. Conservatives overwhelmingly remember the negative images better than the liberals. One might say, hey, conservatives are fixed on the negativity of the past. But it would be equally relevant to point out that liberals are forgetful of these significant dangers that they've previously witnessed. In neurological scans, conservatives were found to have a larger amygdala, the part of the brain that responds to threats, violence, and fear. Now, this doesn't mean that conservatives are scaredy cats. It simply means that they respond to these particular triggers in a heightened way, while liberals tend to have a smaller amygdala. If we were to take a conceptual time machine, right, into the past, our ancestral liberals would likely be inclined to venture into an area that may be more agriculturally beneficial, for growing food or something like that. Or perhaps a region better for hunting, or even an area that's safer to live. While if you were more conservative, perhaps your recommendation would have greater value because it would be safer to stay in the damn cave. These liberal cavemen are leading us right into a large predator's feeding area, potentially. Both ways of thinking provide benefit to the tribe, and today these leanings contribute equally to society. Whatever side of the political fence we end up on, one thing that we're both afraid of is each other. We're both afraid of the other side taking control. Post-Civil War era was a far less divided society than we are today. Studies have shown that we were actually closer to our politics then than we are now. A conservative would hold some liberal concepts while simultaneously a liberal would have some rather conservative views on different political policies. Today, the divide is far more significant. The divergence actually began not too long ago in the 1970s. 92% of conservatives are to the right of the median line of centrism, and 94% of liberals are to the left of it. We are now more divided than we have ever been in the last 150 years. This clustering of ideologies represents a very alarming divide in our principles. On the Right to Reason podcast, I recently interviewed a rather particular man named Anthony Magnabosco, who performs something called street epistemology, where he goes into the street and asks random strangers what they believe and why they believe it. He'll start by asking, what percentage do you believe this thing? And then follow up with questions that challenge these people's doubts and encourage skepticism about their state of belief. Upon closing, he would then ask, what percentage are you now concerning this very strongly held belief that you had before? They typically respond with a lower percentage thereafter. I myself tried this form of, challenging people, but from a political perspective. I would introduce myself to those that I believe to be conservative as a very nice and polite conservative, and then later tell them that I was a liberal. Or vice versa, I would present myself as a liberal to people that I thought was a liberal, and then later I would tell them I was a conservative. Would you like to know what both liberals and conservatives asked me after the test? What does each camp really have in common? Well, they would both ask me, how is it that you're such a nice guy? This is because we inherently attribute our conservative and liberal values with morality. And even more interestingly, we all possess the empathy gap that prevents us from expecting our political opposition to be good people. The scariest part of this is that we have learned from Hibbing's study that the side of the gap you end up on is predetermined for you subconsciously and without your knowledge. Thomas Jefferson, on June of 1813, wrote a letter to John Adams that said this about the liberals and conservatives of his time, called the Whigs and Tories. The same political parties which now agitate the United States have existed through all time. Think about this the next time you're arguing politics with a friend, coworker, or family member, and try to remember, we're all in this together.
We're all in this together, and it shows when we stand hand in hand, make our dreams come true.
You were supposed to see that. I'm sorry. Hey, listen, if you learned something new today, you might want to know that this is not the whole show. This is actually just a segment of the podcast that you can find on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your other podcasts. The rest of the show includes debates and conversations with fascinating guests from multiple areas of research, activism, religion, and politics. Feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, join the debate on Twitter or Facebook, support us at patreon.com/right, and learn more at therighttoreason.com.